Okay, so welcome to this new session of our course. Today's session will be the first session of the neuroophthalmology. So we are going to discuss the neuroophthalmology topics from the perspective of different exams, such as, or with particular emphasis on the ICO and the FRCS exams. So let's get started immediately with the topics of this lecture or of this of the neuroophthalmology. So we are going to cover through the next few lectures or the next two lectures about the clinical anatomy of the visual pathway, followed by the visual field effects and the neuroimaging, some important concepts about the neuroimaging such as CT and the MRI. Then the main part of the lecture will be about the optic neuropathies. Then we will go through the pupillary disorders, so to recover what are the different causes of small pupil or larger pupil. Finally, we will come to the another important part, which is the supranuclear disorders, ocular myopathies, and nystagmus. So let's get started immediately about the clinical anatomy. If you are not expecting that we are going to discuss the anatomy, so this will not be the case here. We will just point or illustrate some important points that will be important for our understanding to the neuroophthalmology. So basically, the visual pathway starts by the retina of both eyes, which carry the visual impulses through the retinal nerve fiber layer, passing through the optic nerve, through the optic chiasm, where the res decussation will occur. So the temporal fibers will pass on the ipsilateral optic tract, and the nasal fibers will decussate to the contralateral optic tract. Then the optic tract will synapse in the lateral geniculate body, where there will be optic radiations, superior and inferior optic radiation, or temporal and parietal optic radiations that will meet again at the occipital cortex to meet in the occipital, the primary visual cortex, where some fibers will pass to the secondary visual cortex. So let's have a main closer look about the important clinical aspects about different anatomical parts of the visual pathway. So starting from the optic nerve, so the optic nerve is consisting of four parts. The intraocular part, which is the optic disc, it is 1 millimeter part. And the second part will be the retroocular part, which is the intraorbital. It will be a freely mobile part, like it will be the longest parts, about 25 millimeters, followed by the intracanalicular part, which is a fixed part of about 9 millimeters, and then the intracranial parts, which is 16 millimeters, meeting the other parts from the other side. So what is the important clinical aspects here? First of all, the intraocular part. The optic nerve itself consists of 1.2 million nerve fibers. So it will be around 45 to 50 millimeter in length, and starting by the intraocular part. Usually, or basically, the myelination of the optic nerve starts from the behind the optic disc or from the retroocular part. However, in some cases, in some congenital anomalies, this myelination spread forward to affect the retina or affect the peripapillary area, causing a congenital anomaly called the peripapillary myelinated nerve fiber. So this is again a congenital anomaly related to the anatomy and embryology of the optic disc. Also, the important thing about the intraorbital part, it allows the mobility of the globe, while the intracanalicular part is fixed to the periosteum of the optic canal, which makes it more liable to trauma, to be the optic nerve to be lacerated at that part because it is already fixed to the periosteum of the bone. So cases of traumatic optic neuropathy are more common to occur at this place. Another thing about the optic nerve is the entry of the superior or the retinal artery and retinal vein through the optic nerve. So actually the retinal artery and the retinal vein perforate the optic nerve sheaths around 4 millimeters behind the globe. So this is a very important clinical landmark, because sometimes we got confused which diseases can cause optic disc pallor and which diseases can cause optic disc edema. So the secret is here. The secret is where is the lesion is located in respect to the site of entry of retinal vein. So if it is in front of it, like if there is like inflammation of the optic disc, or if there is ischemia in the optic disc, in this case, the lesion will cause edema and pallor. So starting by edema, then followed by pallor. So this will cause obstruction of the venous return, and like in case of papilledema, there is obstruction of the exoplasmic flow, preventing the venous return to the brain, leading to engorgement and swelling of the optic disc. This is just one example. On the other hand, if the lesion is involving the optic nerve behind the entry of the ophthalmic vein, central ophthalmic vein, in this case, the lesion will cause pallor from the start. So you got it now? This is just in relation to where will be the lesion. This will be the case. After the optic nerve, both the intracranial parts of the right optic nerve and left optic nerve meet together. They meet in a quadrangular structure called the optic chiasma. So the optic nerve coming from the right eye and the optic nerve from the left eye, they meet together in the chiasma. So this chiasma has a specific anatomical representation of the optic nerve fibers, which will be important to understand what will be the common visual field effects. Basically, the temporal fibers passing in the optic nerve will pass uncrossed into the ipsilateral optic tract, while the nasal fibers in the optic nerve decussate to the other side and then descend into the contralateral optic tract. So the optic tract contains two kinds of fibers from both eyes, contain the ipsilateral temporal fibers and the contralateral nasal fibers. An important clue or an important anatomical detail here is that the decussation will make what's called anterior knee of Fulbrand and posterior knee of Fulbrand, meaning that the nasal fibers will decussate into the contralateral optic nerve, forming what's called anterior knee of Fulbrand before descending down through the contralateral optic tract. And this is for the inferior nasal fibers. And also the superior nasal fibers will make a posterior knee of Fulbrand into the ipsilateral optic tract before decussating through the chiasm and descending through the contralateral optic tract. So nasal fibers will decussate. However, before decussation, they will make what's called knee of Fulbrand. This is very important because this is what will explain later on what is meant by junctional scotoma. So this is junctional scotoma based on this fibers representation. Also, in order to understand what are the visual field effects that are related to the chiasma, you need to have a visualization of what is the relation of the chiasma in respect to the surrounding structures. So the chiasma here lies at the floor of the third ventricle. So if there is a lesion in the third ventricle, like craniopharyngioma, it will involve the superior aspect of the chiasm, leading to inferior visual field effect. In contrary, if there is involvement of a lesion in the pituitary gland, like a pituitary tumor, so this pituitary tumor or pituitary adenoma will involve the lower part of the chiasma, leading to involvement of the superior fibers or involvement of the inferior fibers. So it will result in superior scotoma, as we will see later on. So this is representation is very important to know. Where is the chiasma? The chiasma is bounded above by the floor of the third ventricle, below by the pituitary gland, and on both sides there will be the cavernous sinus containing the different cranial nerves and the internal carotid artery. So again, if there is lesion of the internal carotid artery, like internal carotid artery aneurysm, it can compress on the peripheral part or the temporal part of the optic chiasma, leading to a nasal hemifield effect. So you know now where, if there is lesion involving the chiasma from above or from below or from the temporal aspect, what will be the resultant visual field effect. Also, what will be the result of this anatomical representation is this classic picture of band atrophy, which happens with the chiasmal syndrome. in what's the band atrophy, meaning that there is involvement of the temporal fibers and the papillomacular bundles. This involvement will lead to pallor that will involve the temporal aspect and the nasal aspect of the optic disc. So why does this happen? This is basically because of the compression of the central part of the chiasm. What happens when there is compression of the central part of the chiasm? There, like by pituitary adenoma, it will compress on the nasal fibers. These nasal fibers are representing the temporal retina. So there will be involvement of the temporal retina. There will be involvement of the nasal fibers that will represent the temporal field. So there will be here, you can see that there is involvement of the nasal fibers, the decussating nasal fibers. But why there is involvement of the papillomacular bundle? This is because of the involvement of the central fibers. The central fibers that decussate posteriorly in the chiasm, so when they are involved, they will be representing the papillomacular bundle, leading to involvement of the temporal aspect or causing temporal pallor. So there will be both temporal pallor and the nasal pallor, giving this characteristic band atrophy. After that, after the chiasm, there will be the optic tract. So the optic tract, as we know now, it will carry the ipsilateral temporal fibers and the decussating nasal fibers from the other side. You see, this is the optic tract, carry the ipsilateral temporal fibers of the right eye and decussating nasal fibers from the other eye. Important clinical aspect here is the pupillary fibers. So most of the optic nerve fibers are visual fibers that will represent vision, while there is a small portion of the optic nerve which will consist of pupillary fibers, which are responsible for the pupillary light reflex. So both of them will be carried on the optic tract. So they will be passed from the optic nerve to the optic chiasm to the optic tract, as you can see here. Through the pupillary fibers will pass through the optic nerve, optic chiasm, and optic tract. However, as the pupillary fibers pass through the optic tract, they will not pass into the lateral geniculate body. This is very important. So this is the lateral geniculate body. You can see that the fibers skip the lateral geniculate body, so that you know this is a subcortical reflex. So this is very important to know which lesions that may cause a relative afferent pupillary defect and which lesions will not cause that. This depends on involvement of the pupillary fibers. So if there is a lesion involving the occipital cortex or radiation, as we are going to see now, so after the fibers passing through the lateral geniculate body, they will split into temporal radiation and parietal radiation. So this is the temporal radiation, this is the parietal radiation, which represented the superior retinal quadrants, representing the inferior visual field, while this is the temporal radiation, which are representing the inferior retinal quadrants or superior visual field. So a lesion here will involve, a lesion in the parietal radiation will cause inferior visual field defect, and the lesion in the parietal, the temporal radiations will cause superior visual field defects. Okay, and so here again, let's see. This is the lateral geniculate body, and this is parietal radiation and the temporal radiation. So what we are wanted to say here is that the pupillary fibers does not pass through the lateral geniculate body. They skip it and to pass into the pretectal nucleus, so that they will pass to the brainstem centers, while the optic visual fibers will continue through the lateral geniculate body and then reach the temporal radiations and parietal radiations over the split, and then they will meet again at the occipital cortex. So they will meet again in the primary visual area, or area 17, or the striate cortex, while some fibers pass from the primary visual area to the secondary visual area, so for more visual processing. Okay,